Welcome to our final week of English 205, if you can believe it. Today I want to talk about the sonnet, okay? Your fourth poem for me is going to consist of a sonnet in some form, okay? Now this may not be a perfectly rhymed iambic pentameter sonnet, but it's going to be a poem somehow informed by the sonnet tradition. All right. Now, why am I having you do this? That's a fair question, right? Because up to this point, we've been focusing primarily on free verse poetry, even though some of you have been experimenting with rhyme and so forth. But why am I having you write a sonnet? Well, I like to have students write in one traditional received form, and I think that the sonnet is the best candidate. I don't always pick a sonnet. Sometimes I have students write a villanelle or a pantoum. These are other sorts of forms. But the sonnet is by far the most popular traditional form in lyric poetry. Okay, it's been written for hundreds and hundreds of years. So many of them have been written, right? For many people, the sonnet is kind of synonymous with what poetry is, right? So it's very popular. The sonnet is a form that you see even now in our climate of free verse poetry. Sonnets are popping up everywhere. Okay, and you'll see some of that in the packet on Blackboard that I want you to read. But also, learning to write a good sonnet it can help you write your free verse poems. Okay, and this is because the sonnet has been so influential in the history of English poetry that it has marked the form of free verse poetry, right? Some of the same things that you see in the sonnet, particularly the turn or volta that we're going to talk about, that same turn shows up in free verse poetry all the time, right? So understanding the dynamics of a sonnet, of a short sonnet, can really help you in whatever kind of poetry you are interested in composing. Okay, so that's why I want us to try this final poem as a sonnet. All right. So what is a sonnet? Well, it's a 14-line poem, right? It's kind of a box shape, right? And so you can often you often know that something's a sonnet before you count the lines, right? Because it kind of just looks like a little box, right? Very identifiable verse form here. Traditionally, they've been written in iambic pentameter, right? But no longer. That's not necessarily the case any longer. Excuse me. And you certainly don't have to write in iambic pentameter because that's something we haven't really worked on, right, so much. But basically, 14 lines, and it includes something called this turn here, right? And so those are the two attributes: the length, 14 lines, and the turn that I'm going to have you focus on in your own sonnets. All right. I want to just proceed a little bit through the history of the sonnet here, kind of give you some background so you know where we're coming from. The sonnet was originally an Italian form. Okay, it began in Sicily. Okay, it began with a little ways after Sicily, a couple hundred years after Sicily. This guy named Francesco Petrarca started writing a bunch of sonnets, right? And he wrote them. They were love sonnets. He wrote them to this woman that he adored named Laura, right? So if you hear about Laura in poetry, it's this kind of a symbol for the ideal muse, the ideal love object, right? And so Petrarch and some other Italians, some other sonneteer friends developed what we now refer to as the Petrarchan sonnet. Okay, and that is simply 14 lines, right? Of course, and these 14 lines are divided up into an octave, right, which consists of the first 8 lines, okay, and then a sestet, which is the last 6 lines. Octave and then sestet. 8 plus 6 obviously is 14, right? So in the octave, in the first 8 lines, traditionally what happens is, this was the case for Petrarch, he would kind of introduce a sort of opening statement, a problem, a situation of some kind, okay? And then this situation or problem or issue in the last 6 lines, after the turn, between lines 8 and 9, is somehow kind of resolved, right? Or brought to some kind of resolution or closure. Okay, so we have the statement of a problem, and then the solution. All right, 8 lines of problem, 6 lines of solution. Okay, basically, roughly, the first poem in your packet by actually an English poet who kind of took this verse form to England, Sir Thomas Wyatt. That is that's the sort of structure that he is working with there. Okay, introduce some kind of situation here, and then in the final 6 lines, this is sort of kind of brought to some sort of, even if it's a tenuous, some kind of resolution. All right, even if it's a tenuous resolution here. Okay. Petrarchan sonnets also have their own specific rhyme scheme. Okay, it varies a little bit depending on who you're, who is employing the Petrarchan sonnet. But typically it's A B B A, C D E, C D E. Okay, I believe that's kind of the overarching Petrarchan rhyme scheme. All right, so and we can see that in Whoso Lists to Hunt by Sir Thomas Wyatt, first poem in your packet here. We have hind, behind, more, sore, mind, wind. Those might have been perfect rhymes back when Sir Thomas Wyatt was writing. Let's see, afore, therefore, right, and then doubt, about, vain, am, plain, tame. Okay, so if you're interested in writing a Petrarchan sonnet, this might be a rhyme scheme that you want to try to adopt. Okay, so after Petrarch, right, after the Petrarchan sonnet, some of these English, typically guys here, unfortunately, took the sonnet form and imported it to England. Okay, and in the course of doing so, there were some kind of shifts that happened to the form. All right, Sir Thomas Wyatt and this guy named Surrey started to kind of shift the emphasis away from the volta between the octave and the sestet, between lines 8 and 9. Kind of shifted the volta, the turn, to the last 2 lines, to a couplet. Okay, so instead of introducing the problem in the first 8 lines, the problem would sort of develop throughout the first 12 lines, and then in the final couplet, there would be kind of an immediate resolution, or some kind of breaking away from the problem and some kind of statement or conclusion. Okay, and this gave rise to what we call the Shakespearean sonnet. Okay, so the other major form of the sonnet, right? Obviously popularized by Shakespeare himself. Okay. So in this case, the couplet is going to be what provides the turn in the poem, right? And so your example of that is, of course, by Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Right, famous poem, right? So you can go through. You see that the rhyme scheme, excuse me, is a little different here. We have day, may, temperate, date, shines, declines, dimmed, untrimmed, fade, shade, oast, grossed. So it's an A-B rhyme scheme throughout the first 12 lines, and then we have a couplet, a rhyming couplet at the end. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Beautiful. Right? It's sort of Shakespeare's answer to the problem that he has developed, or the issue that he is talking about in the first 12 lines here. Okay? So, to summarize the main differences between the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet is divided up into 8 lines and then 6 lines, and the turn from problem to solution kind of occurs in the middle there between lines 8 and 9. In the Shakespearean sonnet, the problem develops throughout the poem until the couplet, when Shakespeare says, nope, and he kind of provides a solution there in a nice pat rhyming couplet. All right? Those 2 basic forms, right? Ever since these 2 forms were introduced, people have been varying them. All right, they've been making their adjustments, sort of sometimes combining elements of both of them. Right, sometimes you kind of have 2 turns in the poem. Basically playing around with the received conventions, and this becomes especially apparent, of course, in the 20th century. It's also apparent in the 21st century, but initially in the 20th century, right? When poets said, "Hey, wait, maybe my sonnet isn't going to rhyme, right? So I'm going to throw out the rhyme. Maybe it's not going to be in iambic pentameter, so I throw out the iambic pentameter. And maybe instead of in the 9th line, or instead of in the 13th line, my turn is going to be in the final line of the poem, or in the 10th line of the poem, or something like that. So the turn, the volta, where we sort of move from problem to solution, or the poem turns in some respect, changes place, right? We throw out the meter, we throw out the rhyme. Sometimes sonnets aren't even 14 lines anymore, right? Though often they still are. So I've included in the rest of your packet some examples of more contemporary sonnets, all right? The first one is by Robert Hayden, a very, very famous poem. You'll notice that there is no rhyme scheme here, right? No necessarily, iambic pentameter isn't regular here either. But we still have the traces of the Shakespearean couplet. Okay, so read the poem. It's a beautiful poem. It's about the speaker's relationship with his father, right? And then these famous last two lines, what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Okay, so that's a finishing couplet. It doesn't rhyme, so it's not a perfect couplet anymore, but it still has the effect of answering the poem, answering the problem, the issues developed throughout the rest of the poem, right? Then we have, let's see, Karen Volkman, okay, who's a younger poet, and here Karen Volkman is really riffing on the kind of the sound patterns and the rhyme scheme of the sonnet tradition, right? And so she's actually sort of combining, very interestingly, elements of the Shakespearean rhyme scheme, elements of the Petrarchan rhyme scheme, and just creating beautiful music. I mean, just read the poem out loud a couple times and just kind of marvel at what's being done here. Now, nothing was ever what it claimed to be, the earth blue egg in its seeping shell, dispensing damage like a hollow hell, inchling weeping for a minor sea. It's very cool. It's very cool. So this is also a great example of what can happen when a contemporary poet decides to work heavily with sound, right? Which is pretty interesting. And this is something that some of you are also, I've seen, interested in doing. So Karen Volkman might be a good model for you there. The next one is a poem by Amy, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name, but she's a fantastic poet, right? Amy N, we'll call her. Are all the breakups in your poems real, right? So kind of a sort of take on the love, right? The idea of love as a subject for the sonnet, which is the sort of traditional subject matter, right? Love and war, often. It began as love with Petrarch and Laura, but then war somehow, as it often does, kind of seeped into the issue there. And then the final poem by Henri Cole, Oil and Steel, again, free verse, largely, right? Although there is some interesting kind of rhyme work going on here, subtle rhyme work. But very straightforward, very plain language, talking about, again, interestingly enough, relationship between the speaker and the father, like Robert Hayden's poem. But you'll notice here, even though you could easily miss this for a sonnet. You could easily read this poem and say, oh, that doesn't really seem like a sonnet to me, but there is a turn here, and in fact the turn of the poem actually happens, I think, in the very last line, right? So read that over and kind of see if you can identify the turn, what happens in the turn, how this is working, how Henri Cole kind of presents the situation and then sort of answers it or resolves it or provides some kind of answer here. It's very interesting. The sonnet is a remarkably versatile tool, right? It can address really anything, right? And the forms that its form can take, right, or the variations on the form are really infinite. It's pretty amazing, and that's what makes it such a durable form. That's why we've been writing these things for hundreds and hundreds of years here. So for your poem, I would like you to simply write a sonnet that is 14 lines, okay, so make it 14 lines, although those lines don't have to be iambic pentameter and they do not have to rhyme, okay, it's just 14 lines, and then give us a turn, give us a great turn somewhere in the poem. At some point, let the speaker kind of change directions, kind of comment on the situation or provide some kind of new perspective or leap to somewhere else. Okay, this is something that you already do intuitively in your free verse poems, but just kind of pay attention to how it works in the sonnet as the kind of pivotal move in the poem. All right, and again, this does not have to happen between the octave and the sestet, between the first 8 lines and the last 6. It doesn't have to happen in the last couplet, although it may. Okay, find some place for the turn that kind of fits naturally with the development of the poem. All right, so 14 lines. Give me a turn here, and if you want to rhyme, pick either the Petrarchan rhyme scheme or the Shakespearean rhyme scheme and go for it, okay? In today's assignment, I'm going to ask you to kind of search around for another sonnet online. So while you're doing that, feel free to read more about the sonnet, read more about the rhyme schemes, the history of the sonnet, other sonneteers, etc. I encourage you to do that. All right. The idea is that even when you're not using the exact form, even when you're not writing a sonnet exactly like Petrarch or exactly like Shakespeare would do it, you're still kind of haunted by these forms. These forms are in the language, right? And so when we write, we have to be aware of how these things are working. Okay, so have fun with it. Email me questions. I really look forward to reading these, both in the version I'm going to get on this week. I think it's Wednesday, right? And then also, of course, in your final portfolios, where they'll be revised in some manner. Okay, guys? Great. Thanks a lot.